You saw her long before she noticed you, or so you believed, but something strange began that day. A feeling without name, as if a memory had slipped into the room before either of you had arrived. She did not look at you, not truly, and yet you felt seen in a way that made your spine ache. Not from warmth, from exposure. She blinked, and you forgot what you were about to say. She smiled, and the rules you thought you followed began to dissolve. You told yourself she was kind. You told yourself she was shy. But the silence between her glances wasn't emptiness, it was precision. You had been touched, not by her hands, but by something older, something coiled. Later, you asked what did she want, but the better question, the one you never let reach the surface, was what she already knew, because part of you was waiting to be taken, and another part had left with her before the first word was spoken. You never understood when it began, only that it never felt like a beginning. It was as though she entered through a door that had always existed in the back of your mind. A passage carved long ago, behind the curtains of memory where dreams ferment and decay. Her presence did not surprise you, it confirmed something you never dared admit, that you had already been waiting for her, that your desire was not new, that it had roots in a place older than choice. You saw her and knew her, not as one knows a stranger, but as one remembers a secret they had promised to forget. And in her eyes, there was no reflection of you, only a stillness, a space too silent to be empty. You spoke, hoping to be heard, but the words felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone you no longer were. She smiled politely, nodded slowly, but her gaze moved through you, not toward you, and you felt it, not rejection, not judgment, but something worse, a clinical curiosity. You were not a man to her, you were a mirror, and she was not looking into it to see herself, but to watch you realize there was nothing behind your performance. You asked her about small things, as men do, where she had been, what she liked, what she dreamed, but none of it mattered. What mattered was what you did not say. What mattered was how you glanced away when her silence became unbearable. You asked her nothing of her shadow, because you feared it would recognize yours. You offered charm, wit, control, but beneath it all, you waited for her to notice the trembling, and she did. You never asked why she leaned in just close enough to be remembered, but never close enough to be touched. You never asked how her absence felt more tangible than your presence. You chalked it up to mystery, to allure, to feminine magic. But what she offered was not magic, it was knowledge, brutal, unspoken knowledge. She knew what part of you was still ruled by the mother's glance, the teacher's approval, the girl who first laughed when you cried. She knew you were not here to conquer, but to be disarmed. She knew that your confidence was a scream muffled by rituals, the cologne, the posture, the rehearsed danger in your voice. She didn't need to listen, she had already dissected you. You mistook her gaze for innocence, but it was not innocence, it was expertise. The way she allowed silence to unfold, like a dress slipping off her shoulder without movement. The way her breath slowed when you began to stammer. The way she blinked only when your sentence needed approval. These were not accidents, they were instruments. You thought you were the subject, and she, the object, but she had already inverted the frame. You were reacting, you were being seen, and it made you feel more alive than being loved ever did. She spoke softly, when she spoke at all, but her pauses did more damage than her sentences. And in those quiet moments, you realized too late that you had given her access to the part of you that never grew up, the part that wanted to be watched, the part that longed to be told what he was. the part that hoped she would name him, fix him, hold him, not out of maternal grace, but because being chosen by the unknowable felt like salvation. It was not about her. It was about what you had buried, and how she stood at the edge of that burial site like an archaeologist disguised in perfume. You tried to outmaneuver it. You tried to seduce her back, with mystery, with detachment, with other women, but nothing landed. She watched it all the way one watches a cat chasing its tail, with amusement, with pity, not because she was cruel, but because she didn't need to play. You were doing it all for her, the hunger, the performance, the retreat, the return. She only needed to remain slightly out of reach, slightly not yours, slightly indifferent, and you would consume yourself on her behalf. You called it passion, you told your friends you couldn't read her, but in truth, you read her too well and it undid you, because in that clarity, you saw the architecture of your desire. You saw the mother who gave only when you were quiet. You saw the teacher who favored the boys who looked ashamed. You saw the pattern, the tighter you clung, the colder they became. And still, you followed it. Not because it worked, but because it felt like home. She became a fixation, not because she was special, but because she was precise. She mirrored the woman your unconscious had been carving from fragments of early pain and unfinished stories. She fit into the wound, seamlessly, painlessly, terrifyingly, and you mistook that fit for fate. Later, you would speak of her like a mystery. You would say she confused you, seduced you, bewitched you, but deep down, you knew she revealed you. She pulled the curtain from the machinery. She exposed how easily you collapse into longing when faced with someone who withholds affection just right, someone who drips approval like anesthesia, someone who becomes the mother, the judge, the stage. You never really wanted her. You wanted the feeling she evoked, the ache, the hunger, the pursuit without end. You wanted her to give you the permission to be whole, but she never would, because that was never her role. She was the vessel for your projection, and she knew it. She had met men like you before. She knew how they burned, how they begged, how they boasted. She knew they came not to see her, but to be seen. And she gave them just enough a glance, a pause, a question before stepping back into the shadow that made them feel alive. You were not the first, you were not the last, but in that moment, you were hers. Not because she loved you, but because you needed her more than truth. And in that need, you gave her power. Not the power of action, but the deeper kind, the power of being the screen upon which your inner boy projected his first unmet desire. She didn't use you. She didn't even have to touch you. You handed her the key. You whispered the password. You knelt before the mirror and begged it to speak. But the mirror offered nothing. No reflection, only the echo of your own voice, asking quietly, endlessly why she never stayed, why she never wanted you back, why she made you feel so seen and so unmade at once. And you will never answer it, because the question was never hers. It was yours. And it always has been. You don't remember when you stopped desiring her and started watching her. Or maybe the two were always the same. But there came a moment, subtle, precise, when wanting no longer surged through your veins like fire, but settled into the corners of your eyes. You studied her now, as if by deciphering each gesture, you could unravel the thread that kept her just out of reach. Not to possess her, not really, but to expose her, to catch her in the act of being aware of her effect on you, because you suspected it didn't you, that she was not simply desirable, but aware of being desired. And in that awareness, she held something you did not control. She walked into a room differently than others, as if she knew she would be watched. Not because she demanded it, but because she had long ago accepted it as a natural law, like gravity. The tilt of her chin, the delay in her blink, the way her silence pressed just enough against the conversation to make you lean forward without knowing why. This was not seduction. This was orchestration. And you, though you hated the word, were an audience. You told yourself you had the upper hand, that your insights gave you distance. You called her predictable, said she liked attention, said she played games. But all of it was camouflage for the unbearable truth you could not stop watching. Not because she asked you to, but because the mystery was not in her. It was in the part of you that kept returning, over and over, like a child peeking through the keyhole of a locked room, knowing full well that what lay inside would shatter him. There was something unbearable in how she withheld her certainty. She never confessed, never clarified, never leaned too far into the flame. She stayed near enough to warm you, far enough to leave you cold. You began to resent her restraint. You thought if she would just say something, just name what was between you, the spell would break. But she never did. She let you do the naming, the projecting, the dreaming, and with each unreturned glance, she peeled something away from you. You tried to touch her once, not with your hands, but with a truth. You told her something real, something unguarded. You expected softness in return. Instead, you received observation. She listened. She even nodded, but her eyes did not blink, and in that unblinking, something inside you collapsed. Not because she mocked you, she didn't, but because she refused to mirror the tenderness you had risked. She offered no return, only the space where your vulnerability could echo. That's when you realized she was not simply disinterested, she was recording, and suddenly, every memory you had of her rewound itself in your mind with new meaning. That time she asked about your past not out of affection, but to map your weaknesses. That time she held eye contact just a second longer, not from shyness, but to test your reaction. That time she smiled and said nothing while your hands fumbled, not because she didn't know what to say, but because silence gave her more information than words ever could. You began to feel like a subject in her private experiment. Every move you made was met with stillness. Every confession received with neutrality. You were dancing in a one-way mirror, exposed, performing unraveling while she stood behind the glass with a clipboard, detached, almost clinical. You told yourself she was cruel, but she wasn't. She was curious, and your suffering was not a violation to her, it was data. At night, when the lights were low and your mind began to blur at the edges, you imagined her watching you from afar, not out of love, not out of longing, but out of habit, like a scientist who can't help but glance at her subject once more, just to see if the pattern holds. You hated her for it, and you needed her for it, because no one had ever seen your subconscious unravel so completely. Not even you. There's something you still don't want to admit, not even now. That part of you liked being watched. That part of you wanted to be decoded, not loved, not held, but understood. Because love could lie, words could pretend, but the gaze, that cold, steady gaze, could not be tricked. It either saw the truth, or it didn't. And when she looked at you without blinking, without reaching, without softening, you knew she had seen it. The truth you'd hidden beneath your laughter. The need, the boy. She made no effort to fix you. That was the worst part. Others had offered comfort. Others had told you it would pass. But she let it rot in the open. She let your desire hang in the air like smoke, never wafting it away, never inhaling it either. She allowed you to drown in your own projection. And from that distance, something inside her seemed to smile, not from malice, but from recognition. She knew this pattern. She had watched it before, and still, You followed the script to its end. You blamed her. You told others she was manipulative. But what did she do? Really, she spoke when spoken to. She smiled when smiled at. She didn't chase. She didn't cling. She didn't confess. She only watched. And in that watching, she became a cathedral for your wounds, a temple built from silence. You entered to scream, and she offered no echo. You wept, and she tilted her head slightly, not to console, but to hear the note of your suffering more clearly. The unbearable part was not her rejection, it was her restraint, her refusal to react. You wanted something, anything, to break the spell. Anger, desire, disgust. But she gave you nothing, because nothing is what you feared most, and nothing is what you had hidden inside you all along. Still, you kept coming back. Not because you loved her, but because the wound she revealed was older than her, and the only way to believe it was real was to watch her not touch it. She became a ritual, a habit, a slow self-destruction you disguised as devotion. You brought her gifts she never asked for. You told her stories she never requested. You showed her scars she never reached for. And through it all, she remained just close enough to notice, just distant enough to be untouchable. You dreamed of reversing it, of watching her suffer, of becoming the one who watched. But that was the final cruelty. You couldn't, because you had nothing to withhold. She had never needed anything from you, not your love, not your rage, not your longing. She had already seen all of it, and she remained unmoved. She wasn't heartless. She simply didn't play, and that more than cruelty was the source of her power. Because power doesn't come from domination, it comes from indifference. And you had never met someone so indifferent to your survival, so you keep watching, even now. Not to win, not to love, but to understand what part of you still believes that being watched, silently, mercilessly, without reward, is the closest you will ever come to being real. You began to understand. Though you would never say it aloud, she did not speak because she did not have to. In her silence, there was no emptiness, only rain. It was not a lack of voice. It was a throne built of withheld answers. While you scrambled to interpret every glance, every tilt of her head, every breath delayed by half a second, she remained unmoved. Because the moment she needed to speak, she would have fallen from power, but she never did. She ruled not by gesture, not by sound, but by her refusal to clarify your meaning in her world. You called her quiet, but she wasn't. You heard her everywhere, in your thoughts, in the pause between your sentences, in the way you checked your reflection for traces of a man she might approve of. She lived in the space between anticipation and collapse, where desire is stretched thin enough to become pain. She never gave you more. She didn't need to, because what you imagined was always stronger than what she could give. And she knew it. That's what made her dangerous, not her body, not her charm, but her discipline. She never revealed herself. She let you construct her, brick by brick. Every memory you projected onto her face, she accepted without protest. You gave her tragedy, and she wore it. You gave her innocence, and she let it linger in the corners of her silence. You gave her danger, and she allowed you to believe she might be sharp beneath the softness. But she never confirmed. She never denied. She allowed, and in that allowance, she became untouchable. You thought you were chasing a woman, but you weren't. You were chasing a position, an internal hierarchy older than love, the fantasy of being chosen by the one who chooses nothing, the fantasy of being the exception, the one who melts the unmelting, breaks the rule, awakens the cold goddess. That's what you wanted, not her touch, not her body. but her surrender, her transformation, her proof that you could undo her. But she never broke, and that undid you. There's a word you never use, though it trembles just behind your lips, submission. You wanted hers, though you would never admit it, because you feared that to want it was to confess your weakness. But she saw it anyway. She saw the hunger in your restraint, the obedience in your flirtation, the trembling in your jokes. She saw that your desire wasn't built on dominance, but on the dream of being conquered through your conquest. You didn't want to win. You wanted her to let you win, to step down from her throne and choose you, not because you earned it, but because you had become necessary. But she never needed you, and that's where her power lived, not in her beauty, not in her silence, but in her absence of need. She could leave you without explanation. She could vanish and return without apology. She could sit across from you and say nothing, and still make you feel like your heart was on trial, and you would come back, again and again, not because she promised anything, but because her silence whispered that something might still be given. The irony is that you feared women who wanted too much, and now, the one who wants nothing has destroyed you more completely than all the others combined. Because her indifference forces you to confront the truth, your identity was never built on love. It was built on reaction. You existed in relation to others, their approval, their attention, their desire. And now that she offers you nothing, no praise, no resistance, no need, you are left with a terrifying question. Who are you when no one is watching? She doesn't ask you this. She doesn't have to. Her silence is the question. A throne with no occupant, a mirror with no reflection. You sit before her, performing manhood, performing depth, performing desire, and she watches and still says nothing. Because she is not the woman you chase. She's the space where your illusions collapse. You wanted to possess her, but she had already possessed you. Quietly, elegantly, without motion. She lives in your sentences now, in the pause before you reach out, in the silence after a woman says your name. You compare them all to her not because she was perfect, but because she revealed how unformed you still are. And nothing terrifies you more than the woman who does not flinch when you bare your soul. Do you understand now? It wasn't love. It wasn't obsession. It was confrontation. She was the part of you that does not yield, the cold, silent core you've avoided all your life. And the more you tried to melt her, the more she became you. She gave you no rituals to follow, no path to her heart, no clear sign. And that lack of narrative shattered you, because it forced you to see that you are not the author of your desire, you are the reader. And she is the page that refuses to end. Sometimes you still think of her, not with longing, but with shame, because now you know the pain wasn't from what she withheld, it was from what she reflected. The little boy who still lives behind your smile, the desperate need for affirmation, the belief that power lies in being chosen. She made no promises, but in your mind, she broke them, because you had already written the script, and she refused to perform. You hate her for that, and you worship her for that, because no one else had the strength to leave your fantasy intact. Everyone else bent, everyone else gave, but she let you drown in the dream. She handed you the crown of your own illusion and watched you wear it until it shattered. You called her cruel, but cruelty requires intent, and she had none. She didn't destroy you, she simply did not save you. And maybe that's worse, because being ignored by a goddess is more painful than being punished by a lover. She taught you nothing, and yet now you know. You know that your desire was never about her. It was about the myth of yourself you hoped she would believe in. The strong, mysterious, tragic man who could tame the untamable, but she saw through it. Not with disgust, with silence. And in that silence, you saw the truth. You were not tragic. You were not mysterious. You were just unfinished. And she was a mirror that refused to lie. That is the throne inside her silence. And you still kneel before it. Not to be chosen. Not to be loved. But to be seen. Without illusion. Without flattery. Without hope. Just seen. You haven't heard her voice in years. But sometimes, in dreams, it arrives. Not in words, in the space between them. A door opening behind you that was never there before. A gaze you feel on the nape of your neck, though the room is empty. A perfume that smells like memory, like something you were never meant to survive. She never returns in full, only in fragments. The way a throne still casts a shadow long after the monarch has gone. The way silence lingers in a room that once held a question no one dared answer. The way a mirror, cracked, still shows your face, just not the way you remembered it. You asked her what she wanted, but the better question, the one that never stops humming beneath your skin, is why you still wait for an answer from someone who never asked anything.